Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another chapter from our Hometown Scrapbook. Today's story, Home Guard. Hello there. On Friday, it will be 32 years since the glad news was flashed over the world that the First World War had come to an end. We talked about one of the stirring events of those long ago years when America was fighting the war to end all wars. That was last night in the story of the SS Aberdeen, built in 23 days. And tonight we're going back there again to ferret out another story of that era when young America, which was really young in world affairs, took a hand in what was called the greatest war of all times, a hand that tipped the balance to the allies of the West and brought the great conflict to an end, at least for a generation. But tonight we're going to talk about people. Specifically, the group of people, young and old, large and small, who played their part in that war as residents of Grays Harbor. We're going to tell you about the Old Home Guard Company that was mustered in to take the place of Company G when those guardmen marched off to fight the enemy. It's nothing much of an epic as the people of Vermont tell about their neighbors named Ethan Allen, or folks down in San Antonio relate about a group of young fellows who shot it out at a place called the Alamo. No, it's not history for the sake of history, but it's a right good yarn as we find it in our hometown scrapbook, because it's another of those stories about ourselves. Dick, suppose you take these few seconds for a word from our sponsor, and we'll unrail the story of Company H. When President Wilson sounded the clarion on April 6, 1917, and the nation threw down its glove to the Kaiser, Grays Harbor had a pair of military establishments. There was Company G of the Washington National Guard. It had just returned from a summer on the Mexican border where it had been ordered with the old 2nd Washington Regiment to corral Pancho Villa. The Grays Harbor boys of that outfit had camped in the scorching hot sun of Calexico from June to October and then came home without firing a shot. But they had learned a lot about soldiering, and when they were mustered in the following April, they were a pretty good outfit. Harry Comeau left his furniture store on Heron Street and buckled on his saber as captain of Company G. Miller Cook was its first lieutenant, and Jim Sexton, the veterans of foreign wars, named the Aberdeen post after him when he was among those who didn't come back. Jim Sexton was the shave-tail. Company G joined its regiment at Camp Murray. Dr. O.R. Austin was regimental surgeon and went east to Camp Mills, Long Island, where they loaded on board the SS Lincoln and sailed for Brest, France. You pass some of those old Company G men on the streets almost every day. When First Sergeant Carter was transferred out after their arrival in France, Charlie Cryer was made top kick. Charlie lives in Hoquiam today and admits that he's fought his last war. There was Cal Tiemann, Corporal Tiemann, who sells suits at Joe Barkley's. Oh, there are quite a few of them still around. Their outfit was in France, and the men fed into the famed 1st and 2nd Divisions as replacements. That was Company G. Then there was the Naval Reserve Unit, the Grays Harbor Naval Militia, they called the outfit. Bill Donovan Jr. was the skipper. He wore an elegant stripe and a half and shared the unit's top rank with his executive officer, Jack Freeman. Then there was Ensign Van Stiglitz and a group of others one-stripers that included Hugh Delaney, Earl Conley, Frank Rockwell, Kirk Morak, and Harry Collins. The naval militia, entrained at Hoquiam for their trip to Bremerton, where they were mustered in and promptly assigned to the battleship South Dakota, which had just been overhauled in that Navy Yard. They shouldered their sea bags and hammocks, those able seamen of 31 years ago, and filed aboard the ship that was to take them 22 times across the Atlantic to South America and into the thick of the submarine-infested waters. Their roll call would have echoed such names as Ira Birch, Ralph Ammon, Bob Ingram, Nick McGowan, Elman Samden, Bill Eberton, Bob Savage, pharmacist Al Holland, Charles Chamberlain, Carl Weatherwax, Don Lyons, and Pete Oberts. They were the naval militia. They, and a lot of more names equally familiar and too long to list in its entirety. Well, with the boys gone, Grays Harbor was pretty quiet for a time. Oh, there was shipbuilding splurge, and new people were crowding into town to take their place in the lumber camps and sawmills and shipyards. I guess you'd hardly call it quiet. But the state of Washington decided that it needed a military unit down here just in case. There had been trouble with the IWWSs, and there were trouble makers at large. They called them wobblies in those days, wobblies. So they called for men to join the Home Guard, the too young and the too old, the draft exempt and the age exempt. And they flocked to join the company. J. Weatherwax was selected as captain by vote of the first members, supported by the staff that included, and he was Lieutenant Clyde Pritchard, Lieutenant Charles Emmerich, and C.W. Duffin, and others. The company was assembled in what had been the National Guard Armory, the old Knights of Pythias Hall, but what is today the Union Hall on 1st Street between G and H Street. They were assigned lockers, and the state provided them with uniforms. The problem of weapons was solved when they managed to obtain some of the rifles taken from the arms-running sailing ship, the Annie Larson, whose equipment was stored in a building on Hume Street, State Street today, that is now occupied by the Salvation Army. The men were equipped with the model 1873 Springfields with needle bayonets, and they began to drill. Seriously, too. The ever-present problem of the Wobblies was on their minds. So when there were rumors of wobbly marches on Aberdeen to seize the remaining cache of arms in the old building on Hume Street, the captain of the Company H took quick action. He dispatched a squad to the City Hall under Corporal Bob Taggett and another squad under Corporal Lentz Davenport to the Annie Larson's arm cache on Hume Street. And just to make sure that the enemy wouldn't complete a coup d'etat, he sent a squad to the old Windsor Hotel to seize and hold a small arsenal of arms that the manager, Charles Pratt, had collected from Powder Horton flintlocks to Arabian blunderbusters. However, the captain failed to obtain proper authority for his mobilization of such armed strength, and the state cracked down. They felt that it would be in the best interest of Company H if the command was placed along to someone less impulsive. It was the beginning of a series of new commands that kept the outfit supplied with what amounted to a new commander every few months. But Company H continued to increase in size and fighting fitness. It held examinations for sergeants and others. Harry Phipps, Arthur Graham, Fred Weatherwax, Bob Taggart, Jim Riley, Lloyd Flower were selected. Jelly Gerard became a corporal in that outfit. By this time, a look down the front ranks revealed the most businessmen in town. George Sutcliffe was number one in the front. There was W.C. Mama, Roscoe Conrad, Carl Beckenhart, E.B. Carey, Seward Axland, Edgar Anderson and his father, Ed Anderson. B.B. Jones, the photographer, was in the files with Harry Thompson, Roy Sargent, Doc Payne, A.J. Grant, Bob Rose, Phil Shriek. There was a great scattering of youngsters too young to get into the fighting war. Fred Teague, Art Van Camp, Sig Noren, Pete Murchison, Walt Faulkner, and others. But many of them were to be called from Company H before many months to join the regular forces, and some to go overseas. There was A.G. Hopkins, who fought with the Northern forces in the Civil War, but who still had starch to hike along with the best of the young ones. The town's music teacher, S.B. Thatcher, was a bugler, and he blew his long blow and stirring blast of his instruments to the slightest provocation before, during, and after drill formations. Company H drilled on Monday nights regularly, and once the roll had been called and the company turned out into formation, they were marched up and down the back streets of the downtown area behind Right Guide Sergeant Harry Phipps, an Irish tenor who led the singing of the popular marching song, "It's a Long Way to Tipperary," or "Goodbye Broadway." But Company H had some strenuous activities before it. As the country got deeper into the war, the shortage of manpower began to tell, and the government began to look over the Home Guard units for possible sources of additional military strength. They passed down an order that the men must have been given a rigid physical exam, and all those beyond certain age brackets released. That opened up some big holes in Company H, but the ranks were filled with newcomers of qualifying age. Then Uncle Sam turned to equipping the Home Guard. A big order of Russian rifles had been produced in the state. They had been marked for Russian, but the revolution had stopped them at the docks, and the United States government seized them for the use by the Home Guard. There was much more modern rifles than the old Springfield shingle-shot weapons, but still not up to the model 1918 Army rifle. However, so equipped, Company H was called up to Camp Murray to be field trained. They held target practice on their own range at the Montesano Garden Tracks, where they had erected targets, and had a few field maneuvers on the open ground at Brady. But this was the very first real military service, around the clock, day after day. It was late into the summer of 1918 when they began their training, and the word was passed that they would probably be going to the Philippines to replace an army unit for duty in Europe. It was becoming serious, this home guarding. But before they reached the expeditionary stage, the Hindenburg Line crumbled, the Kaiser abdicated, and the Allies marched into Berlin. The war was over, and the boys of Company H got ready to turn in their uniforms. The state kept them on the rolls for several months after the end of hostilities, but finally they turned in their Russian rifles and their uniforms and called it a job, and Company H became a matter of record and an entry in our hometown scrapbook. Now, Dick, suppose you say a few words from our sponsor. The military organizations that the First World War era had their share in creating, and some of them are remembered today for their part in the activities of that era. There was Bert Short, Sergeant Short as he was known to the harbor. Bert Short was a barber back before the First World War, but active in National Guard activities, and he became the first sergeant of Company G. The old National Guard outfit saw its first action on the Mexican border in 1916, and Short was top kick of the outfit when it entrained for the border campaign. He was a military man at heart, a soldier even when he cut hair. He stood as stiff as a ramrod and walked erect in marching cadence. In his uniform, he looked the part of a top kick. But when the company returned to the harbor and before they were called to duty in France, Bert Short was passed over because of his large family and his age. He was not with the unit that went overseas, but with his bulge and his trim military figure, he was a participant in almost all patriotic activities of the years of the First World War. He played taps at memorial ceremonies and stirring calls of charge and buying rallies. He instructed the high school cadets in military training when the activity was taken up by the schools in 1918, and he was very much a part of the military life of Grays Harbor when it was reflecting the spirit of the embattled nation back there in 1918, and such he is a character that we find and recall tonight in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a good night.